I'm telling this story now because I have to. Not because I want to, or because I think it will change anything, but because the silence has become a weight I can no longer bear alone. For years I've held this inside, a toxic secret that has corroded my life from the inside out, isolating me more completely than any physical distance ever could. People who knew me before, the few that are left, they see the change. They see the haunted look in my eyes, the way I never sit with my back to a window, the rifle that is as much a part of my attire as my boots. They attribute it to grief, to solitude, to the slow, inevitable eccentricities of an old man living too far from civilization. They are wrong. It is not eccentricity. It is vigilance. And I'm telling this story now because last week I found proof that my vigilance is not only justified, it is tragically insufficient. The thing I saw, the thing I know is out there, it remembers me. And it is patient. My name is Arthur Hale. I am 67 years old, and for 42 of those years I have lived on this plot of land. 120 acres of dense woods and rolling hills in Itasca County, Minnesota, pressed up against the vast, untamed expanse of the George Washington State Forest. This land was my father's, and his father's before him. It is in my blood as much as the iron-rich water from the well. I worked for 35 years as a land surveyor, a profession that demands precision, observation, and an unwavering respect for the empirical. I deal in facts, in measurements, in the unyielding logic of geography and physics. My world is one of angles, degrees, and the solid, reassuring truth of a boundary marker driven deep into the earth. I'm not a man given to flights of fancy or prone to superstition. I believe in what I can see, measure, and document. That is why this is so difficult, because what I have seen defies measurement, and what I have documented defies belief. My life here has always been governed by routines, by the predictable and comforting rhythms of the seasons. In the spring, I walk the 4 miles of fence line that mark my property, replacing posts rotted by the winter melt and restringing wire pulled down by heavy snows. In the summer, I tend my garden, cut and split wood for the coming winter, and battle the endless encroachment of buckthorn and thistle. Autumn is for preparation, for sealing the house against the coming cold, for cleaning the chimney, and for watching the woods explode in a final, defiant burst of color. Winter is a time of quiet contemplation, of sitting by the wood stove with my German Shepherd Boone, reading old maps and listening to the wind howl its lonely song through the pines. For 40 years, this was the shape of my existence. It was a good life, a quiet life, a life where the only real dangers were a falling tree and a high wind, a slip on an icy patch, or the occasional black bear rummaging through the trash if I forgot to secure the lids. I knew the rules of this place. I knew the sounds of the forest at every hour of the day and night, the call of the barred owl, the yip and howl of a distant coyote pack, the heavy tread of a bull moose in the swamp, the delicate rustle of a foraging deer. These were the voices of my world, and I was fluent in their language. The first sign that the rules were changing, that a new and terrible grammar was being written into the landscape, came on a Tuesday in late October, 6 years ago. The air had that sharp, clean edge to it, the smell of decaying leaves and the promise of snow. I was on my northern fence line, the section that borders the state forest, doing my final patrol before the first real blizzard was due to hit. Boone was with me, as always, trotting ahead with his nose to the ground, a picture of confident, happy purpose. It was about 2 in the afternoon, the sun already low in the southern sky, casting long, distorted shadows through the birch and aspen. That's when I found it. A section of fence, about 20 feet long, was utterly demolished. Now, fence damage is a part of life out here. A heavy, snow-laden branch can fall and snap the wires. A panicked deer can get tangled and tear a section down. A bull moose, full of autumnal rage, can walk through it as if it were made of thread. I have seen all of these things 100 times. This was different. The fence here is 4-strand barbed wire, 12.5 gauge high-tensile steel, strung on 6-inch diameter cedar posts at 8 feet apart. It's designed to contain cattle, which I haven't kept for years, but I maintain it out of habit and a sense of order. The top 2 strands of wire were not sagging or stretched. They were snapped. The breaks were clean, sharp, as if cut by enormous bolt cutters, but the steel at the break was slightly curled, indicating a tensile failure. An immense, pulling force had been applied. The bottom 2 strands were not broken. They were bent downwards, pressed so hard into the earth that they were buried in the leaf litter. The wire itself kinked and twisted around the base of the posts. The most unsettling part was the post. The main cedar post in the middle of the damaged section, one I had set myself a decade prior, was shattered. Not at the base, where rot might have weakened it, but about 5 feet up from the ground. It wasn't a clean break, like you'd get from an impact. The wood was splintered, twisted, the fibers pulled apart as if the top of the post had been gripped by something of incredible power and wrenched sideways until it failed. I stood there for a long time, just looking. Boone, who would normally be sniffing around with great interest, was standing a few yards behind me, the fur on his back slightly raised, emitting a low, guttural whine from deep in his chest. He would not approach the broken fence. My surveyor's mind went to work, cycling through the possibilities, dismissing them one by one. A falling tree? There were no downed trees or heavy branches nearby, and the damage was too specific. A combination of pulling and pushing forces that a deadfall couldn't create. A moose? A moose would have simply walked through, bending or breaking all 4 strands and likely knocking the post over at the base. It wouldn't have snapped the top wires while pressing the bottom ones into the ground. A bear? A black bear, even a large one, doesn't have the focus, tensile strength to snap steel wire like that. And there were no claw marks on the post, which would have been shredded if a bear had tried to climb or push it. Vandals? This was the most plausible yet least likely explanation. We are miles from any town. The idea of someone hauling heavy-duty cutters and a hydraulic press all the way out here to perform such a bizarre act of vandalism seemed absurd. There was no logic to it. It was destruction without purpose, displaying a kind of strength that didn't fit any animal I knew. I took a few photographs with my phone, more out of habit than anything else. The scale was wrong. The sheer physics of it were wrong. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a feeling of profound wrongness that had nothing to do with the cost of the repairs. That day, for the first time in 40 years, I felt like a stranger on my own land. I spent the next day repairing the fence, my senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind made me jump. I started carrying my old Ruger Blackhawk in its holster on my hip, chambered in .44 Magnum. It felt foolish, an overreaction, but it also felt necessary. I also began a log, a simple, spiral-bound notebook where I recorded the date, time, weather conditions, and my observations. The surveyor in me needed to document, to impose order on what felt like encroaching chaos. The first entry was for October 28th. Found northern fence line down, approximately 20-foot section. Top 2 wires snapped, bottom 2 pressed to ground. Center cedar post broken at 5-foot height. No tracks, no clear cause. Boone agitated. Repaired. It looked sparse and clinical on the page, but it represented a fundamental shift in my world. The known had been breached by the unknown. A week passed. The first snows came and went, leaving a thin, crusty layer on the frozen ground. The woods grew quieter, the sounds muffled by the blanket of white. I had almost convinced myself that the fence incident was a fluke, a one-off mystery that would never be solved. Then I found the deer. I was checking a small clearing where I usually see does and fawns sheltering from the wind. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the usual smell of decay, which is a familiar, almost earthy scent in the woods. This was different. It was coppery and sharp, the smell of fresh blood, mixed with a rank, musky odor like nothing I had ever encountered. It was thick, clinging to the cold air. Boone, who was about 20 feet ahead of me, stopped dead in his tracks. His body went rigid, his tail tucked so far between his legs it was almost touching his stomach. A low, continuous growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, instinctual terror. In the center of the clearing was what was left of a large, white-tailed buck. I've seen hundreds of predator kills in my life. Wolf, coyote, bear, they all have a signature. They are efficient, driven by hunger. They eat the soft underbelly first, the organs. There's a pattern to it, a logic of survival. This was not that. This was an atrocity. The buck's neck was clearly broken, but that was the least of the damage. Its rib cage had been ripped open, the ribs splayed outwards like the struts of a broken umbrella. The force required to do that to a mature buck is astronomical. Large portions of the backstraps and hindquarters were gone, torn away in huge chunks, not neatly eaten. The rest of the carcass, including the nutrient-rich organs, was largely untouched. It was a kill of unbelievable violence, more akin to a rage-fueled demolition than a hunt for sustenance. But the most disturbing detail, the one that made the hair on my arms stand up, was the silence. Normally, a fresh kill like this would be a hub of activity. Crows, ravens, jays, foxes, weasels, the scavengers of the forest would be arguing over the spoils. But there was nothing. The clearing was dead silent. The trees stood like silent, stone-faced witnesses. Not a single bird called. It was as if a perimeter of fear had been drawn around the carcass, a warning that even the hungriest creature in the woods dared not cross. I took my photos, my hands shaking so badly I had to steady my phone with both hands. I made my notes in the logbook, my pen digging into the paper. November 5th, found deer carcass, mature buck, extreme trauma, rib cage splayed open, no scavenger activity, pervasive musk odor, Boone exhibiting extreme fear response. I did not touch the carcass. I backed away slowly, pulling a reluctant Boone with me, and did not stop until the house was in sight. The sensory anomalies began to escalate after that. The profound, unnatural silence I'd felt at the deer kill started to manifest in other parts of the property. I would be walking a familiar trail, and suddenly the world would go quiet. Not just calm, but a heavy, oppressive silence where even the sound of my own breathing seemed too loud. It felt like the air pressure was dropping, a weighted blanket of absolute stillness descending upon the woods. The feeling of being watched became a near-constant companion. It was a physical sensation, a prickling on the back of my neck, an instinctual certainty that I was under observation from the shadows. I found myself scanning the tree line constantly, searching for a shape that didn't belong. The smell would return too. Faint at first, a greasy canine musk on the wind, then stronger, a wave of rot and wet fur that would make my stomach turn. It was never traceable. It was just there. And then it was gone, a phantom scent that left a residue of pure dread. My routine changed. My walks became patrols. My gaze was no longer relaxed, taking in the beauty of the woods. It was a constant, sweeping search for threats. I began carrying the Marlin 1895 lever-action rifle, chambered in .45-70 government, a round capable of stopping anything on the North American continent. The heavy, solid weight of it slung over my shoulder was the only comfort I had. I installed 2 trail cameras, Moultrie M80S, one overlooking the repaired section of fence and the other watching the clearing where I found the deer. I checked the memory cards every 2 days, my heart pounding each time I plugged them into my computer. For weeks, they showed me nothing but the ordinary life of the forest. A doe and her fawns cautiously picking their way through the clearing, a fat raccoon sniffing at the camera lens, a fox trotting past with a mouse in its mouth. The mundane images were a relief, but they didn't erase the feeling of wrongness that had taken root in my gut. The first direct sighting happened on November 21st. It was late afternoon, the sun already a pale, watery disk behind a thin layer of gray cloud. An early, wet snow had fallen overnight, just an inch or two, enough to cling to the branches and record the passage of anything that walked. The temperature was dropping, and the air was still. I was heading to the deer stand on the far western edge of my property, a small, elevated platform nailed between 2 large white pines. I wasn't hunting. I just wanted to check if the ladder was still sound after the storm. Boone was acting strangely again, staying so close to my leg that I kept tripping over him. He wasn't sniffing or exploring, just moving with me, his head on a constant swivel, his ears twitching. We were about 80 yards from the stand when I heard it, a single, loud crack. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. It was the sharp percussive report of a thick, green limb being snapped. It was a sound of weight and power. I froze instantly, my hand tightening on the rifle slung over my shoulder. Boone let out a low growl, a deep vibration I could feel through the sole of my boot. I slowly raised my binoculars and scanned the tree line ahead. The woods were a tangled mess of gray trunks and snow-dusted branches, a perfect camouflage. For a full minute, I saw nothing. Then, movement. A shape, dark against the gray landscape, detached itself from the deep shadow of a massive balsam fir. My first thought was bear, but it was the wrong shape. It was too tall, too lean. It was standing on two legs. It wasn't a man. The posture was all wrong. A predatory hunch to the shoulders, the arms too long, hanging down past its knees. It was massive, easily a foot taller than me, and I stand 6 feet. It was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. The light was failing fast, painting everything in shades of gray and purple, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was not a bear, and it was not a man. It stood perfectly still, and I realized with a jolt of ice-cold fear that it was watching us. It knew we were there. It had been waiting. As I stared, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing, it slowly turned its head in my direction. The distance was too great to make out fine details, but the general shape of the head was long, tapered like a wolf or a large dog. Then, for a single heart-stopping second, it shifted its position slightly, and the fading light caught its eyes. They were not the soft, reflected green of a deer or the pale yellow of a cat. They were a deep, smoldering orange-red. They didn't just reflect the light, they seemed to generate their own, a malevolent, intelligent glow from within the shadows. We were locked in a silent standoff. Time seemed to stretch and warp. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Boone's growl had become a steady, desperate warning. The creature did not move a muscle. It just watched, its presence radiating a palpable sense of menace that transcended mere animal aggression. This was something else. This was intelligent. This was ancient and powerful and utterly alien. After what felt like an eternity but was probably no more than a minute, it took a single, slow step sideways. It moved with a terrifying fluidity, a predator's grace that seemed impossible for a creature of its size. It didn't make a sound. The snow-covered ground didn't crunch. It simply slid back into the deep shadow of the fir tree and vanished. It didn't run. It was just there, and then it was not. The silence it left behind was a physical thing. It pressed in on me, deafening and vast. I stood frozen for another minute, my knuckles white on the stock of my rifle, straining to see or hear anything. There was nothing. The woods were empty again, but it was a predatory emptiness now. The kind of quiet that comes after a hawk has snatched a rabbit from a field. I began to back away, slowly, deliberately, pulling Boone with me. I did not turn my back on that spot in the woods. I walked backwards for 100 yards, my eyes locked on the space where it had been, my rifle held at the ready. Only when I was sure there was enough distance between us did I turn and half walk, half run back to the solid, reassuring walls of my house. I bolted the door, slid the heavy bar across it, and sat in the dark, the marlin across my lap, until the sun came up. The next morning, I went back. It took every ounce of will I possessed. I was armed not only with the 45-70 but with a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer just a frightened man. I was an investigator. I had to have proof. I had to have evidence that wasn't just a fleeting shadow in the failing light. The light snow from the day before was a perfect canvas. I found the spot where it had been standing, and I found the tracks. They were enormous. A single print was a good 14 inches long and nearly 7 inches wide at the palm. It was clearly canine in shape, with 4 distinct toe pads and the imprint of heavy, non-retractable claws. But it was not a dog's track. Behind the main pad was a distinct, elongated heel, a feature of a plantigrade, or flat-footed walker, like a bear or a human. It was a monstrous hybrid of a wolf's paw and a man's foot, and the stride was terrifying. I followed the tracks as they led away from the tree line and deeper into the state forest. They were laid out in a straight line, a bipedal gait. I measured the distance between them. The stride was a consistent 6.5 feet. A creature that could cover that much ground in a single, casual step was impossibly large and powerful. I photographed the tracks from every angle, using a ruler for scale. I made a plaster cast of the clearest print, my hands trembling as I mixed the cold water and powder. Here, finally, was tangible proof. This was not a ghost. This was flesh and blood. That afternoon, I bought 3 more trail cameras and a case of D-cell batteries. I placed them in a wide perimeter around the area of the sighting, concealing them as best I could. My life became a cycle of fear and data collection. Every morning, I would make the tense journey to the cameras, swap out the memory cards, and retreat to the safety of my house to review the footage. The forest on my computer screen was a silent black and white world. I saw deer, raccoons, fishers, a lone wolf, even a bobcat. But of the creature, there was nothing. Weeks turned into a month. The deep winter snows arrived, burying the landscape, and I hoped, whatever was out there. The woods returned to their familiar dormant state. The oppressive silence lifted. The feeling of being watched faded. I started to wonder if perhaps the thing had just been passing through, a transient horror that had moved on to new hunting grounds. The fear remained, a low hum beneath the surface of my daze, but the immediate heart-pounding terror began to recede. The winter passed in this state of uneasy peace. When the spring thaw came, I found myself examining every patch of mud for tracks, my head on a constant swivel. The paranoia had become ingrained. In April, my nearest neighbor, a man named Tom Hendrickson, who lived about 2 miles down the road, lost a calf. He blamed wolves, which had been getting bolder in the area. A week later, he lost another. He set traps, but caught nothing. He found no tracks, no sign of a struggle. The calves had simply vanished from a fenced pasture. The news sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. This wasn't just about me anymore. I gathered my evidence. The logbook, the high-resolution photos of the fence and the deer carcass, the pictures of the tracks with the ruler beside them, and the plaster cast, wrapped carefully in a towel. I drove into town to see Sheriff Brody. Dave Brody was a decent man, a few years younger than me. We weren't friends, but we had known each other for 20 years, the kind of easy, nodding acquaintance common in small towns. His office smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. He listened patiently as I laid out my story, my voice calm and measured. I presented it not as a panicked rambling, but as a methodical investigation. I showed him the photographs. I pointed out the tensile break in the wire, the impossible damage to the buck, the disturbing hybrid nature of the tracks. I handed him the heavy plaster cast. He looked at everything, turning the cast over in his hands. He nodded slowly. "Art," he said, his voice gentle. "I know you've been through a lot. Losing Martha last year, it takes a toll. And living out there alone, it can play tricks on your mind." He pushed the photos back across the desk toward me. "Look, a bear can do funny things. If it stands up and oversteps its own tracks, you can get a print that looks mighty strange. A big one could probably do a number on your fence if it got spooked. And as for the deer, well, coyotes will tear a carcass up something fierce." He was offering me a ladder back to the world of rational explanations, a way to dismiss my own senses, but I had been over all of it 1,000 times in my own head. "Dave," I said, my voice tight, "a bear doesn't snap high-tensile wire 5 feet off the ground. It doesn't leave a bipedal track with a 6.5-foot stride, and no coyote I've ever seen can rip a deer's ribcage open like that." He sighed, a weary paternal sound. "Okay, Art. I'll tell the deputies to do an extra patrol out your way. But honestly, I think you should take a few days off. Come into town, see some people." He was dismissing me, kindly but firmly. In his eyes, I was no longer a credible witness, just a lonely old man succumbing to the pressures of grief and isolation. I walked out of his office with my box of useless evidence, feeling a profound and terrible sense of abandonment. The world of order and authority had failed. I was on my own. My last attempt to bridge the gap between my reality and the world outside was a phone call to my daughter, Sarah. She's a good kid, a lawyer in Minneapolis, with a life full of things that make sense. I tried to explain what was happening, my voice faltering as I tried to put the sheer primal wrongness of it into words. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was full of a careful, clinical concern that was worse than Brody's dismissal. "Dad, are you eating enough? Are you getting enough sleep? Maybe you should make an appointment with Dr. Evans just for a checkup." She asked if I was taking the blood pressure medication I was supposed to be on. She promised to drive up and visit soon. The call ended with her telling me she loved me, but her tone was the one you use on someone who is unwell, someone who needs to be managed. That call was the last lock turning. It sealed me inside my new reality. My world now consisted of my 120 acres, my dog, my rifle, and the thing in the woods. And so, the new normal began. My home, once my sanctuary, became my fortress. I spent a good portion of my savings reinforcing it. I installed 1/4-inch steel plates behind the door frames and replaced the standard locks with heavy-duty deadbolts. I I put steel security bars on all the ground floor windows, the kind you see on storefronts in bad neighborhoods. The house now had the look of a prison, but I felt like the one under siege. I mounted 4 high-lumen motion-activated floodlights, one on each corner of the house. They were sensitive enough to be triggered by a rabbit, but they gave me a perimeter of harsh, sterile light. The marlin was never more than an arm's length away. At night, it leaned against my nightstand. During the day, it went with me everywhere, from the garden to the woodshed. I stopped going into the woods after dusk entirely. My evening walks with Boone were curtailed. We stayed within the brightly lit circle of the house. Boone changed, too. He was no longer the carefree, happy dog I had raised. He was a sentry. He rarely barked. Instead, he would stand at the window, staring out at the dark tree line, a low, constant growl vibrating in his chest. His senses were tuned to a threat I could only guess at. He was my early warning system, and he was always on duty. My own psychological state deteriorated. Sleep became a series of brief, shallow naps, shattered by every creak of the house or scrape of a branch against the roof. I lost weight. My hands developed a permanent tremor. The solitude I had once cherished now felt like a curse, a vulnerability. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a whisper of malice. I was living in a state of permanent high-alert anxiety, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was a soldier in a war only I knew was being fought. 2 years passed like this. 2 years of grim, exhausting vigilance. There were no more direct signs. No broken fences, no mutilated carcasses. The trail cameras showed only the mundane. The silence in the woods remained, but it was a familiar, if unsettling, presence now. I began to second-guess myself. I would look at the plaster cast, sitting on my mantelpiece like a grotesque trophy, and wonder if Brody and Sarah had been right. Was it possible I had imagined it all, a hallucination born of grief and loneliness? Had I built a prison for myself based on a trick of the light and a misidentified bear track? The doubt was a welcome poison, offering a seductive path back to a world that made sense. I almost let myself believe it. Then came the night of July 18th, the second sighting. It was a hot, oppressively humid night. A violent thunderstorm had raged through just after sunset, and the air was thick and heavy, smelling of rain and ozone. I had fallen into a fitful, shallow sleep, the kind that offers no rest. I was woken by Boone. He wasn't just growling. He was on his feet on my bed, barking, a frantic, desperate sound I hadn't heard from him in years. It was a sound of pure panic. At the same moment, the world outside my window exploded with light. The motion detectors on the back of the house had been triggered, flooding the yard and the edge of the woods with 1,000 watts of cold, white light. I grabbed the marlin, my heart hammering against my ribs, my mind instantly horribly clear. This was it. I moved to the bedroom window, my body low, and peered around the edge of the frame. The floodlights illuminated the yard in stark detail, every blade of wet grass, every puddle from the recent storm rendered in sharp black and white. At the very edge of the light's reach, about 50 yards from my back door, it stood. This was no silhouette. The harsh, direct light caught the glistening texture of its wet fur, which was a dark, patchy black-brown, like a mangy dog's. It was hunched over something on the ground, its back to me. The sheer size of it was breathtaking. Its shoulders were immense, a solid wall of muscle wider than any man's. The arms that ended in thick, clawed hands were long and corded with sinew. It was a creature built for terrifying violence. I slowly raised the rifle, my cheek pressed against the cool wood of the stock, and brought the scope to my eye. The 3 to 9 times magnification brought the scene into sharp, sickening focus. The thing it was hunched over was a dog. A large German shepherd. I recognized it as Tom Hendrickson's dog, Zeus. The creature had it pinned to the ground. As I watched, paralyzed with horror, it raised its head. The scope gave me a view that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. Its snout was long and lupine, but the set of its eyes was disturbingly intelligent, almost human. The fur on its face was shorter, allowing me to see the powerful musculature of its jaw. Its lips were pulled back in a semblance of a snarl, revealing long, yellowed canines. Its jaws were dripping with blood, which steamed in the cool night air. And its eyes. They were the same deep burning orange-red I had seen 2 years before. But this time, They were not just glowing in the dark, they were focused. They stared directly at my window. It knew I was there. It knew I was watching. It felt like it was performing for me. Then, it did something that shattered the last vestiges of my understanding of the natural world. It released the dead dog. It straightened up, unfolding to its full, terrifying height. It had to be 8 feet tall. It stood there for a second, a bipedal nightmare silhouetted against the black woods, its intelligent, malevolent eyes locked on mine. It seemed to be issuing a challenge, a statement of dominance. Then, with a chillingly casual and fluid motion, it bent down, grabbed the 100-pound dead dog in one massive hand as if it were a rag doll, and turned. It didn't run. It simply took 2 long, silent strides and was swallowed by the darkness beyond the reach of the lights. A moment later, the floodlights, their motion sensor no longer detecting movement, clicked off, plunging the yard back into an absolute terrifying blackness. I did not report the death of Tom's dog. What would I have said? That a monster from a child's nightmare had killed it on my lawn as a warning? I buried Zeus the next morning in the woods, far from the house. That night confirmed everything I feared. This was not just an animal. It was a territorial, intelligent, and malevolent entity. It was a predator that remembered encounters, that held grudges. Killing the dog on my lawn under my lights was not a random act of predation. It was a message. This is my territory. You are here on my sufferance. I can reach you whenever I want. I'm telling this story now because of what happened last week. Over the years, I have upgraded my surveillance. The old trail cameras have been replaced with newer high-definition models that run on a solar-charged battery and upload images to a cloud server. One of them is pointed down my long gravel driveway, watching the entrance to my property. I check the images every morning, a ritual as ingrained as my first cup of coffee. It's mostly deer, the occasional delivery truck, the mail carrier. But last Thursday, there was a single image, time-stamped at 3:17 a.m. The image is grainy, taken in infrared night vision. The quality is poor, but it is clear enough. At the end of my driveway, where the gravel meets the county road, a figure is standing. It is tall, bipedal, with the same hunched shoulders and long arms. It is simply standing there, in the middle of the driveway, looking directly toward the house, looking directly at the camera. The date on the timestamp was July 18th, 2 years to the day since it killed Tom Hendrickson's dog, 4 years since my first sighting. It remembers. It has patterns. It operates on a schedule known only to itself. It has been 2 miles away at my neighbor's. It has been 80 yards away in my woods. It has been 50 yards away on my lawn. And now it has been at the end of my driveway, at the very threshold of my world. The perimeter is shrinking. So I sit here now, in the deepening twilight, the marlin across my lap, its metal cool against my legs. Boone is asleep at my feet, but his sleep is never deep. His ears twitch at every sound. I watch the tree line, that dark, impenetrable wall that separates my small island of light from its world. I know it is out there. The silence in the woods tonight is profound, heavy, and watchful. It is not an empty silence. It is the silence of something waiting. And I am waiting too. The only question is for what?